Luistert naar Preston's Poetry Podcast.
You know that film, the one that takes place in that old, forgotten house that those people take over to renovate, looking for a new start that turns out to be haunted? Or maybe there's that one old sitcom, maybe it's just reruns now, but it's set in New York City with its side-by-side row house busyness. Or what about that one book character, that brooding, quiet, traumatized loner? Of course you do. But also you don't, because these could be any number of things. They're just sort of archetypes now, bordering on cliche. When there are these kinds of commonalities, especially after some monumentally great films or stories or whatever, genres form around them. We see patterns emerge when we put them all together. And when we put them all together, we get to decide which examples fit and which don't. These are Westerns. That one is an explorer movie, that one a war movie, a Western drama, not strictly a Western. There are even space Westerns with cowboy-like characters wielding a phaser in a spaceship instead of a horse and a six-shooter. Well, when we put together a lot of the most widely printed poems, what we abstractly call the canon, we can see a pattern. People began to discover this some century or more ago. We can probably safely say right around the turn of Romanticism into the next chapter, whatever we call that, modernism. And the patterns that emerged showed a number of striking similarities. And it wasn't stuff like sonnet forms and iambic pentameter and all that. The poets looked the same. They had similar attitudes towards certain people, generally came from rich families and didn't want for anything. Their skin color matched the next one, and they all seemed to have wives. But the thing about poetry is that while it can be studied, and while people with the luxury of studying can access its wisdom, and while those folks can indeed learn some formal tools like rhyme and a lot of other things we've been talking about here, poetry is not quantum mechanics. It doesn't take an immense amount of studying and prerequisite information to discover. That study may help, which is the base assumption of this whole podcast, but poetry ultimately springs from our humanity, our use of language, and our love of music. It's more primordial than that. It occurs even in some of the most marginal anthropological cases, like the Amazonian language of Piraha. Many anthropologists will claim that there's no prosody or poetry to that language. Until somewhat recently, there weren't even numbers in that language. But what's interesting about the Piraha people is that their language has a very simple series of sounds and tones and rhythms, allowing them to hum or whistle in place of using words. And that's the kind of impulse I'm talking about, that deep-seated compulsion to use sounds and rhythms to produce a kind of meaning. In contrast to the claim that these people don't employ any poetic tools, it seems quite clear to me that they just speak in poetry all the time. Maybe that goes for everybody everywhere, I don't know. But suffice it to say that anthropologists learning and codifying that Piraha language did not invent it. I'll repeat that. Anthropologists learning about and codifying that language did not invent the language. And they may be able to do the language a great service by codifying it and whatever, but this kind of rigorous research can't quite measure up to the bare evolutionary human creation of the language itself. That is the Piraha people's cultural artifact, and poetry comes from that same unseen well of our common souls. In a way, we began to, at some point, lose the forest for the trees. Instead of seeing some of these traditional guys as good poets in their own right, non-exclusive of other people, they began to be seen as authorities, as deciders of what poetry is and isn't. Here I'm going to name some names. I'm talking about Wordsworth, Coleridge, Tennyson, and even earlier ones like Pope and Milton. To me, that's a big overstep. After all, they were decidedly not the only poets. And yet, they were the only ones being called geniuses and being given tons of money for what they do. One of the big discussions in all the arts and humanities centers around the question of how much of that tradition, what we call the canon, how much of that we accept or reject. If so-called tradition has been decided by only a few guys and the narrow view of what they wanted out of poetry, then how much living in their shadow is fair? If they set the rules, do the rules still have merit? If they made up all these systems of counting beats and rhymes and all that, how much of that is true or just their opinion? Well, today I want to talk about the concept of meter. Meter is essentially the system of working with rhythms in poetry. And as I do that, I also kind of want to touch on the way I see this question of history and tradition. To do that, I have the immense pleasure of talking about one of my all-time favorite poets, Gwendolyn Brooks. I think she's a good example of how we can both have tradition and question it, play with it. Gwendolyn Brooks had already written several things before this poem and gained a bit of a name, but this particular poem, We Real Cool, was published in 1959. Some decades earlier, a number of black poets from a region in New York City called Harlem had begun to publish a wealth of literature from the perspective of a black American, famously called the Harlem Renaissance. Brooks, though writing from Topeka, Kansas and Chicago, she grew out of that movement, that tradition. I took a look at several sites just to see what other interpretations are out there, and I noticed that almost none of them mention how decorated a poet Gwendolyn Brooks was. She was not just the first African-American Pulitzer Prize winner in 1950. She was also the Poet Laureate of Illinois in 1968, then Poet Laureate of the United States of America from 85 to 86. She was a recipient of the Robert Frost Medal in 1989 and granted the National Medal of Arts in 1995. That's way more than just a Pulitzer Prize winner in 1950, and even more than just the first African-American Pulitzer Prize winner. Yet, as much of a force as she is and was, I still don't think she gets the recognition she deserves. She was a precisely trained poet, an educator par excellence, a mentor, and an innovator. And to demonstrate her genius, we'll be talking about We Real Cool. It's an English classroom favorite, and for good reason. It touches on cultural subjects previously hinted at or ignored, while it also uses some very, very old poetic techniques, which we'll get into. It's got both a raw folkiness as well as a brass section blaring intelligence. It's a very short poem about 7 young men, pool players, playing pool, outside of a pool joint called the Golden Shovel. Have a listen. The pool players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. This particular poem is about a group of young men who skip school to play pool. They sort of brag about all the hedonistic, rebellious things that they do. They're real cool. They left school, they stay out late, they celebrate sin, they drink gin, and so on. It sounds like the first line reads, we real cool, but actually it's we real cool, period, we. And the next line is skip school, period, we. Now, if you remember my tip about enjambment, you might be tempted to read it like, we real cool, we skip school. But she does this line break for a reason, and I want to focus on that a lot. It takes time to move from we to the next line, just in our minds, causing us to pause for just a moment. What she intends here is for us to pause after we, and that's what creates this sort of jazz rhythm, this syncopation. On the subject of jazz, Brooks writes this in a light dialect. Not we are really cool, but we real cool. Not the highbrow, we court the maiden June. No, we jazz June. And jazz in that time was still a euphemism for sex. Even ragtime has its roots in brothels, with the piano playing constant and loud downstairs to cover up the jazz upstairs. Now, sure, she could have written it like this, yeah? We real cool. We skip school. We hang around till late. We real good at pool. We talk about sin. We drink gin. We screw June. We die soon. But like any other poems we've talked about, clearly that kind of just immediate explanation, like you would get in a novel or something, just falls short. So this is how Brooks really used the tool of meter. We've talked about meter a whole lot, but I've never really directly made an episode about it. Meter is essentially measuring rhythm of words. Classically, this was a pre-decided framework made of little building blocks called feet. And those feet have special little names. We've talked about some of them before, like the iamb, bum bum, or the trochee, trochee. If you think back to the Raven, it's written in trochaic octameter, trochee, 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 trochee. Or perhaps a Shakespeare in iambic pentameter, my mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. And these feet are patterns of usually 2 or 3 stressed or unstressed sounds. Now, there are plenty of other feet than iambs and trochees, though. There are tons of combinations. For instance, the spondee is 2 long stress sounds together, like spondee, usually quantity stressed. Anapests are unstressed, unstressed, stressed, like howdy-do, contradict, understand. Now, while feet are about stresses, those stresses can also either be about hardness or length, called accentual or quantity stresses. Accentual syllabic stresses are about the percussive sounds, once upon a midnight dreary. While stressing by making those sounds longer and more melodic is called quantity stress. Hopkins does this a lot, such as, glory be to God for dappled things. So how hard and percussive is accentual stress, but how long and melodic is quantity stress? Brooks uses quantity stress. It's about the length of the sound. We real cool. You hear how the we's are short and the others are long? So clearly we're counting quantity stresses here. Now, if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, I get it. Especially when I decided to study poetry, I could sense that there was all of this terminology, like all of these foot patterns that I would just have to learn. And just a taste of poetry terminology made me feel both like I was stupid, but also that there was way too much more to learn. So when it came time for me to write a thesis, I picked a subject that would, more than anything, help me to have a solid grasp of what all that was about. And I found that there is so much history and theory ranging all the way to both Greek and Sanskrit texts, to Sappho and the Bhagavad Gita. I found that it's an entire field of study in both poetry and literature, but also in linguistics, called prosody, which is the study of systems of language sounds. And I don't have all of that prosody information memorized. I want you to know that. Even after all of my studies, I only know a few of them by heart really well, and everything else generally I have to remind myself or look them up. What I did get, though, is a grasp of how to look at meter and these poetry building blocks. I know how to use those concepts and how to look for them. And that's also what helps me really unpack poems like this one. I found that I get everything out of it that I put in. So let's do that. What is Brooks doing here? We might think that this is the rhythm. We real cool. We skip school. That's a 3-foot pattern. I looked it up. It's called a Bacchius. And it was named this because in ancient Greece, This was used in hymns to Bacchus. And Bacchus is another name for Dionysus, the Greek and Roman god of festivity, fertility, wine, drinking, dancing, and just partying it up. When we look at Brooks's poem, isn't that the kind of life that she's portraying in these young men? But here's the thing. It's not written, we skip school, we lurk late, we strike straight. Remember? It's written skip school, we jazz June, we. Right? It's flipped. And that is called an antibacchius. It's the reverse. So, is a Bacchius, and an antibacchius is the opposite. Now, about putting we at the end, Brooks said in an interview, which I'll try to give you a link for if you want to read it. But anyway, she says this about these 7 pool players. Quote, "They have no pretensions to any glamour. They're supposedly dropouts, or at least they're in the pool room when they should possibly be in school, since they're probably young enough, or at least those I saw were when I looked into a pool room, and they..." First of all, let me tell you how that's supposed to be said, because there's a reason why I said it out as I did. These are people who are essentially saying, Kilroy is here, we are. But there's a little uncertain of the strength of their identity. Then she reads the poem again and goes on. Quote, "The we, you're supposed to stop after the we and think about it. To think about their validity. And of course, there's no way for you to tell whether it should be said softly or not, I suppose. But I say it rather softly because I want to represent their basic uncertainty, which they don't bother to question every day, of course." So she breaks those lines and she uses the antibacchius to counteract the Bacchiusness, the party-hardy, hedonistic attitude that they seem to have. I suspect the ancient Greeks would have instantly understood what she's doing. Instead of the assertive, we real cool, we skip school, Bacchian meter, the anti-Bacchian, we left school, we... It causes this counterpoint, this doubt about whether they're making good choices in their lives. By that metrical reversal from Bacchius to antibacchius, we are given a much more complex picture of the characters in the story. It's not just a matter of portraying this groovy, jazzing rebellion. There's that hesitation, a point where Brooks also wants us to feel the destructiveness of that lifestyle. This becomes very clear when we reach those last lines. We die soon. A spondee. We really get to feel that doubt. There's a turn, the classical turn, but the spondee, those two stresses, the lengthy die soon, brings the whole scene to this bittersweet end. Anyway, listen to it just one more time, knowing what you know now about foot and meter, and enjoy these rhythms. The pool players, 7 at the golden shovel. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. Before Brooks, iambic pentameter or some other basic formulation was really prevalent, and you either did stuff like Shakespeare or Edgar Allan Poe, or you didn't do it at all, and you were nobody. The Bacchius and antibacchius were, and still are, pretty rare feat to use, making Brooks a little bit of an innovator or reformist in this way. And aside from all the prosody nerdiness, this jazz rhythm, which is so culturally close to Black culture of her time, is at once celebrated and taken up in this poem. And yet it's still deeply, deeply traditional. The two ideas of reforming and standing on the shoulders of giants with Brooks are not exclusive. In fact, I see Gwendolyn Brooks as an even more traditionally rooted poet than any of those dead romantics that overshadowed poets like her for many centuries. But I often get the question, was Brooks really aware of how deeply rooted in this poetic history she was? With this Bacchus and anti-Bacchus thing? How big of an innovator, a reformist, really was she here? Did she know that? Well, in an interview about it, Brooks brings up something I really agree with, and I want to share it with you. The interview asks her, are you saying that the form of this poem then was determined by the colloquial rhythm you were trying to catch? And she answered, no, it was determined by my feeling about these boys, these young men. He then pressed her on that, asking her if she borrowed the idea from other poets like T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound, and if she had any kind of model in mind. And Brooks responded, my gosh, no, I don't even admire Pound, but I do like, for instance, Eliot's Proof Rock and The Wasteland, Portrait of a Lady, and some other of those earlier poems. But nothing of that sort ever entered my mind. When I start writing a poem, I don't think about models or about what anybody else in the world has done. So Brooks didn't really use other poets as models. She just tries to imitate a feeling. But she was clearly also a very precisely trained poet. So one thing is for sure, she's clearly informed by that tradition, and she knows other poets, and she knows those forms. She says later in that interview that she has written a number of sonnets and ballads and so on, but has never made it about the form she writes from her feeling. While clearly still traditional in a way, there's no religious attitude towards tradition out of Brooks. She doesn't write because the Greeks wrote it this way, and it's not because of those Greeks that We Real Cool works. It's because it's true about the human experience, and by virtue of her skills, she gently defends traditional poetry ideas actually against the folks who are trying to write that manual. Someone once asked me how long it takes to write a poem. And I said, around 30 years and an hour. It takes a lifetime or a life so far of experience and reading and learning, informing your gut, your mind, your soul. And then when it comes time to write, just shooting straight from the hip, right out of your gut and impulse. It's about training your gut and then blasting that on paper. I think Brooks would want you to try writing stuff like We Real Cool as well. To try it out, listen to the rhythms of how people talk. Write about some folks you know. Maybe it's a group of old men drinking coffee at the diner, some barbershop babbling, young mothers having the afternoon off to go shopping together, you name it. Try to transcribe some of the stuff they say and repeat it over and over and over until it sounds like music, first capturing their rhythms and intonations. You can even look up metrical feet, literally just Google poetry feet or metrical feet, and look through that list to see if what you've written down falls into a pattern. That's your form. Then try to capture the way they think through the things they say, and let us into how you see them through poetry. What I really love about Gwendolyn Brooks is that she is both traditional and challenges our ideas about tradition. In some ways, as a poet, I see her as a mother and educator. She reminds me that I can separate poetry from the poets, actually freeing me to be a learner of poetry and not just of dead guys. Through her work, she offered a window into what excites her, into who she is, who her people are, how they speak, how they think. She was an educator, she was an activist, and an absolute legend of a poet. Hey y'all, Preston here. My favorite line of today's poem is, "We real cool." Tell me yours or ask me stuff on Preston's Poetry Podcast Instagram or Facebook pages, or at PrestonsPoetryPodcast.com. We'll see y'all.